My name is Sarah, and this is Sandy, who's going to speak for us today. Thanks, Sandy.
Thanks, Sarah. Hey, you can clap.
Yes, my name's Sandy. I work for the university part-time as a statistician, and I also am part of the APS staff team. And obviously the APS staff team supports the Christian Union, the Graduate Christian Union, and Christians in Academia. But Christians in Academia is my focus and my favourite, being a Christian in academia myself. And we also have the best acronym, which is the CIA. Now, the three topics we're doing in these forums, this is the middle one, have been motivated by surveys of the university population. And unfortunately, when you talk to people about topics relevant to Christianity, hypocrisy comes up a lot, and it's hard for us to avoid. And fortunately for you, while I have only limited experience doing good or showing charity, which are the other topics, I have heaps of experience with hypocrisy of my own. So thank you for letting me play to my strengths. But I should say this is quite a serious topic. I think we need to think carefully why Christians have this kind of reputation and what Jesus might have to say in response to that. You can see for my slides today, I've included this picture of a cup that's clean on the outside and dirty on the inside. This is borrowing an image that Jesus uses famously. He describes the leaders of his day as cleaning their outsides, making sure they look good and virtuous, but inside being full of greed and self-indulgence. So I think it's a useful image, and it's quite powerful because it's pretty ludicrous to clean the outside of a cup when the inside is the part that you're actually going to be drinking out of. But I think we all know that it's quite easy in practice to prioritise our outward appearance over the internal reality. And this is the definition of hypocrisy. I think it's helpful for me to define it at the outset. I think most people would say they know it when they see it. And I think we're particularly good at identifying it in other people rather than in ourselves. So the origin of the concept is this kind of idea of an actor, so presenting a particular outward appearance that's inconsistent with the reality of the person. And I don't know who put the image on the Facebook event, but that kind of picture of someone putting a face, a mask on, that's the kind of origins of it. But it's now come to mean just more specifically this idea of giving an appearance of virtue or goodness when that's unrelated to our true character or our inclinations. And you can see this is from the OED, this definition. It even includes a specific reference to religious life or beliefs, to religious hypocrisy. So you may have noticed that the contrast we've set up in the title of this talk is the idea of integrity. So that's where our outward appearance matches the inward reality, so being consistent within ourselves. And I want to maintain that that's the alternative to hypocrisy. It's not perfection, but integrity. But first of all, I wanted to illustrate with a trivial, I think you'll agree, example from my own life. I continue to surprise myself as to the areas of my life in which I find myself trying to hide my weakness or dress up differently to the reality. I've been married for about a year, and sharing life very closely with someone else has brought to my attention more and more ways in which I do this. So for example, I'm going to confess to you that I regularly steal herbs from my neighbour. And my husband was horrified to discover this, actually. This is my preferred rosemary bush. Not only do I steal from my neighbours, but I take photos of their property without their permission. And I'm very good at justifying it. So, you know, I have a friend who's low FODMAP, can't eat garlic, and so flavouring things with rosemary is a nice substitute. And, you know, I also think, look, the rosemary is sticking out onto the footpath. You know, I'm cleaning. It's a community service. But as I thought about it, one of the reasons I like taking rosemary from this particular bush is because the neighbours keep their blinds down. And also, when I realise when I do it, I kind of lurk around looking nonchalant, waiting for the street to clear so that I can grab it and run back to my house without anyone seeing me. So clearly, I'm not actually backing myself and my own behaviour. And if I'm honest, I'm ashamed of what I'm doing. That's why I'm trying to hide it. And then last week, my husband, Tad, who I'm gesturing because he's sitting over there, he sent me a message to say that someone had started picking our lavender in our yard. And I was so enraged. I said, yeah, no, tell her to stop. It's just a small plant. Thief, you know. But again, this just served as a rebuke to me of the inconsistency between my standards and my own behaviour. perhaps you can think of a similar example for yourself. If you drive, then I'm sure you can think of lots of cases where you judge other people's behaviour and don't consider your own. But what I thought I'd do, I'd give you a bit of a chance to share with the person next to you an example that you can think of. If you can think of something, that's great. If not, then I have a question for you in your pairs. Have a think about if I could give you a copy of an exam paper before you had to sit it, and I gave you a 100% guarantee no one would know about it, and this is for a subject that's going to set you up for life, going to get you into the job that you want, would you consider that particular temptation? And I want you to think together about what might be going through your head as you do that. Now, I promise you won't have to share with the rest of the group, so be as honest as you're prepared to be, okay? I'll give you some time for that. Does anyone want to lead us off and share what they were discussing, the example they came up with?
I was thinking of gossiping in the church.
Okay.
And the way that that it was done was packaged in a way like out of concern for this person, but actually they're just enjoying talking about the things that they were doing or their misfortunes.
Yeah, so you can kind of claim that it's for a virtuous reason. I really need to know what's going on with that person because I care about them, when actually you just want to know the latest goss. Yeah, no, that's a great example. Other people? Got something to add? I heard lots of talking, so I'm sure you have examples. Maybe second row, a volunteer from the second row.
Because we were talking about it's kind of culturally sensitive, but we were talking about how olden days when missionaries went in other countries and how they would have probably destroyed the native culture, trying to propagate Christianity. It's almost a sense of they come in with this kind of goodwill, but actually may have background reasons which is, I think this is probably good.
Yeah, it's doing harm to destroy people's culture. Yeah, and it's not fundamental to becoming a Christian to have Western culture or something.
How in general, just Christians tend to put on this kind of false picture of being a saint, as in at least in public, I don't do this, I don't do that, and give this picture of being a good and righteous person, whereas in private they are completely.
Yeah, and sometimes that can come from a good place, I think, of wanting to be like Jesus and wanting people to think, well, Christians are, are like Jesus or something. But yeah, that's right. If it's not the reality, I think people see through that, pretty quickly. Yeah. Another example, maybe third row.
Generosity with money.
Oh, yes, yeah. For example.
There's the actual example of, I know some preachers saying, donate lots of money to my ministry, to me, and God will materially
bless you. Yeah, yep. I need my second private jet or whatever, yeah. Is the stereotype. Yeah.
And also, I know churches having silver and gold cups and things. Could be those expensive items could be sold for all the money and be better spent on other things.
Yeah, so I mean, you could be choosing to make your church beautiful because you want to honour God, but it could, be at the expense of other responsibilities or, ways to things that God asks of us. Yeah. Anyone else want to add an example? Yeah.
Well, there's the
yes, sure.
Yeah, there's a case of the child abuse accusations against the church. As I was saying before, I think part of that reason is it derives from the forced celibacy that's been forced upon the clergy, where if it hadn't been forced on the clergy and they were free to choose whether to be single or to marry, this act of hypocrisy may have been reduced and come more morality.
Yeah, so there were some kind of structural problems that led to that kind of behaviour. Yeah, which is very much at odds with the teaching of the Bible. Yeah, John, did you want to add something?
I think when elder church or denominations or elder church or denomination critical,
Yes.
or like one of the main them is itself critical and sometimes a bit unchristian.
Yeah, so there can be some internal kind of conflict that actually, where that hypocrisy argument is thrown back and forth. Being hypocritical by calling other people hypocritical. Yeah, that's right. But a meta example. Yeah, no, that's good. I put a few ideas down as well. Just some examples, which are more general things, not specific things, but excluding certain groups of people. So Galatians says there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So, here's Paul describing Christian fellowship as being about Jesus and not dependent on other things, but I think there's examples historically where that's been used to cause division between groups of people. Another, I think, big example is I think the church has been naive to our own weaknesses. So 1 Corinthians 10 says, "So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to humankind." So here in 1 Corinthians, Paul's warning the Corinthians not to suppose in their pride that they're immune to temptation. And yet I think churches have neglected appropriate accountability and checks and balances in their conduct with terrible consequences. I think the church has valued rules over relationships. Hosea says, "For I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." The prophet Hosea acknowledges that God values our relationships with him and others more than following rules like ritual sacrifices or offerings. And yet I think, the church has been quick to place burdens and rules on others. And as a consequence, I think that's why there's this public reputation for being judgmental instead of people of grace or mercy. And the Bible itself even has examples of hypocritical followers of God and even leaders. So King David is the most famous ancient king of Israel, is basically the star of a soap opera. I know some of you heard that there was a talk, I see you talk about this recently. But basically one evening he sees a woman named Bathsheba bathing. I'll keep it PG, but she ends up pregnant. And rather than face the consequences, David tries to get rid of her husband Uriah. Tries to get her husband Uriah to come back from war so that it's plausible that he's the father. But he's too noble to enjoy his wife while his comrades are at battle, so he refuses. So instead, David asks the commander to put Uriah at the front line where the fighting is fiercest, and he dies, leaving David free to marry Bathsheba as if it had never happened. Now, rather than concede fault, David keeps seeking to cover up his sin, and with awful consequences for those who are trying to do the right thing around him. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I think hypocrisy is a temptation for everyone. Valuing how we're perceived by others and pretending to be someone we're not is something we all do at some point. But why are Christians particularly painted with this brush? As I said, I think in response to Cleo's comment, I do think genuinely sometimes Christians, we really want to live our lives in a way that honour Jesus in the sight of others. So we set standards for ourselves that are high because they're God's standards, and so we might want to cover up our sin or give a particular perspective, and we justify that on the basis we're making Jesus look good by making the church look good. At worst, I think Christianity has had power for varying degrees throughout history, and Christianity has attracted people who want power. So I think in that situation, it's very easy to feel the need to do whatever we can to hold on to power, like David's example. And look, to some extent, I think that's changing. The church is losing some of that power in politics and society. And I think that loss of power could be what we need in terms of regaining our integrity. I also wanted to say, it's related to my point before about valuing rules over relationships. I think part of the problem with the perception of the church in this area is that rules are just easier than relationships. So it's very easy for us to pick and choose or create Christian-y kind of sounding rules that make us look better than others. We can kind of set the bar to a point that we can reach it, but it's just short of others. But it's harder to do that when it comes to loving or caring for people. I heard a few of you saying this actually in the example of hypocrisy. I heard you talking about whether we're genuine in our love. And I think it's just harder to be sure that we've done enough when it comes to caring for others, and harder to compare ourselves with others. Relationships with people are just more complicated, and as I said, I think people tend to be quite good at seeing through us when we hide behind a bunch of rules. However, the point I want to make in this talk today is I want to argue that hiding weakness is in fact completely contrary to the principles of Christianity and the teaching of Jesus. In fact, I think Jesus gives us the best reasons for personal and corporate honesty and integrity. I do think it's inevitable that Jesus will be judged by the behaviour of his followers. He even warns his disciples that will be the case, but this is not the complete picture. So for the rest of the forum, we're going to listen to Jesus on this matter as to reasons why Christians should not be hypocrites. And I think not only does he talk about this and give advice specifically in his teaching, but I think through his own life, death and resurrection, he gives us hope for combating it. So first, Jesus leaves us in no doubt about his attitude to hypocrisy, and that he doesn't tolerate it. There are lots of examples in the accounts of his life where he speaks out strongly against the religious leaders of his day, and there's an extended account in Matthew 23. I encourage you to read the whole thing. There's a part where he talks about straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel, which is a wonderful image. But I've got a few particular examples here. But they do not do what they do. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. So Jesus doesn't tolerate leaders who demand things of others that they're not prepared or able to do themselves, and he values leaders that seek to help others. Here's another quote. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and be called a rabbi by others. Jesus doesn't tolerate leaders who want authority for their own pride and gratification, and he values humility and servant-heartedness. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy and faithfulness. Jesus doesn't tolerate leaders who are careful to make sure they follow every little rule, including tithing their spices, but are not characterised by justice, mercy and faithfulness. He values what's in our hearts more than our religious observance. And then lastly, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. And here again, the idea of something beautiful on the outside and horrid on the inside, full of dead bodies, which is how Jesus views hypocrisy. So I could give you lots of other examples. Jesus goes on, but I wanted to give you a taste for the level of tolerance that Jesus has for the hypocrisy of the leaders of his day. So when you feel upset or angry at this kind of hypocrisy, you're in good company. And Jesus shares that anger. I think you have a right to think it's not okay, and a right to speak out against institutions that are characterised by this kind of conduct. You also have a right to care and defend the vulnerable. At the end of this passage, Jesus looks at the city under the care of these leaders and says he feels like a hen who wants to gather them up under his wings. He has great compassion for those people affected by this kind of hypocrisy. So I want to mention in particular that I think we're allowed to expect more of our leaders. Jesus himself says that for those who have been given much, have been entrusted with much, much will be expected. So the standards are high. But it's one thing to see hypocrisy and call it out. It's another thing to be able to overcome it. The other answer that I think Jesus gives to the problem of hypocrisy is that Jesus accepts us in our shame. So I want you to imagine if you had a boss who was intolerant of mistakes, who flew off the handle when you deviated from the plan or chose to publicly humiliate you in front of your colleagues for all of your mistakes. Do you think you'd be more inclined to be open about failure in that context, or more likely to cover it up if you had a boss like that? On the other hand, what if you had a boss who was generous with you, whose door was open to hear any of your worries or concerns, who was prepared to own your own mistakes as an organisation and help you overcome them and make it right if it's in their power. What about a boss like that? Would you admit your mistakes to a boss like that? Well, Jesus is like that kind of boss. In Jesus' earthly life, he spent much of his time with people who would have been considered lowest of the low in the society of his day. People like prostitutes and tax collectors, people known to have made bad life choices and publicly shamed for it. He likens himself to a doctor who's come for the sick, not for the healthy. Those who refused to admit their need for him, he couldn't help. But those who came to him in their need and trusting in his power to change that, they were the ones that he came for. As this verse says, Jesus came into the world not to condemn the world, something that characterises hypocrisy and something hypocrites love to do, but he came in order to save the world. And those who came to him, acknowledging that they're not always proud of the person that they can be, but trusting in his mercy, to those people he offers forgiveness and new life through taking on our shame in his death on the cross. This is the wonder of the message of Jesus. Jesus knows what we're capable of and knows that our whitewashed exterior hides a darker interior, but he chooses in his mercy to accept us, warts and all. In his own death and resurrection, he negotiates that tension between being deeply aware of our failure, but also deeply valuing us as we are. And I think this ought to motivate our integrity. So God's mercy is completely at odds with hypocrisy in this way. So in Paul's letter to the Romans, he accuses his readers of judging others and points out that this judgment is actually an indictment on them, as they are no different. So he says the following: so when you, a mere human being, pass judgment on them and yet do the same things, do you think you will escape God's judgment? Or do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness, forbearance and patience, not realising that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance? Knowing God's kindness to us shouldn't drive us to pride or judgment of others, but confessing what we've done and repenting. Not just toward God, but toward each other, admitting our mistakes and accepting the mistakes of others, and committing to make things right where possible. And I think this needs to be at an institutional level, including letting prosecutions take place where necessary, as well as taking responsibility for reparation to victims. I also want to illustrate with the example of David again. He was continually covering up his sin, but that wasn't actually the end of the story. I left off the last line of that section where he said what David had done had displeased the Lord. And David is subsequently rebuked by a prophet for his behaviour and becomes personally convicted by that. In response, he confesses his sin, not just privately, but in the words of a song to be sung by countless people for thousands of years, about his need for God's mercy and God's eagerness to forgive. We had a talk on it recently, I'm sure some of you were there, but here's a quote from that psalm. He says, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions." And he goes on to say, "Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me." And in this psalm, he even commits to teaching others this truth and encouraging them to turn back to God. So I wanted to have a kind of think about how this might look in practice for us. How can we combat our own hypocrisy? Well, I think it helps a lot if we listen to Jesus. In preparing for this forum today, he's convicted me a lot on these issues as I've read and reread what he has to say. And we've actually looked a lot at what he has to say today, but that's really only a taste of what the Bible has to say on these issues. I also think we need to accept his forgiveness if we have a hope of being able to be honest with ourselves and honest about ourselves with others. It's a terrifying thing to be honest and accountable to others, but if we can find people who we trust, people who are prepared to be honest with us, people who listen to Jesus, they're the kind of people who are going to have high standards for one another and for us, but also the grace to accept when those standards aren't always met. And I think this kind of accountability has to exist in institutions as well. The church can't afford to be naive and must anticipate the worst of humanity in the way it addresses some of these issues structurally in order to be able to be a safe place for people. I already mentioned that I think the expectations of leaders are even greater, both expectations from Jesus, and I think our world puts leaders, elevates them and expects more of them. And, you know, the top class Melbourne Uni graduates that you're all going to be, most of you will have some form of leadership in your life, whether that's in your chosen profession or in the church. So I think it's all the more essential that you listen to Jesus, to assure each other of his forgiveness and to be accountable to one another. But this is just the beginning of the discussion today. Those are my thoughts. I'd love for us to have a discussion as a group as well. So do you need to say anything, Sarah, before
You can
we have questions? Yeah. Anyone have any questions?